This video compiles my entire Intro to Motion Graphics 2021 series into a single video. Don't worry about the fact that it's now 2022, all techniques are still absolutely relevant and you'll be able to follow along, no problem at all. I'm releasing it for free here on YouTube in its entirety. So let's jump right in.
TipTut.
Hello everybody, welcome back to TipTut and welcome to Intro to Motion Graphics 2021. I'm really excited about this series. It's an update to an old one that I did and it's in my opinion, much better already, just based on the example that we'll be creating. So we'll be making something similar to this that you're seeing on the screen right now. It's going to cover all of the basic techniques that you need as a complete beginner to After Effects and motion graphics. From everything from working with text and graphics to adjustment layers and expressions and things like that, and masks and all these important things that you will then be able to apply to any different project. So hopefully this will be a really good starting point for a lot of you people. Now, we encourage creativity here at TipTut, but if you'd like, you can download a reference image from the website and recreate this exactly, or you can do the same thing and recreate it with different words and text and colors and things like that. So with that in mind, there's a few resources I'm going to take you through before we get started. So I've just opened up a blank copy of After Effects here, and the few things that you will need are the reference image if you're going down that route. So if you go to tiptut.xyz, the link is in the description, and click on the resources page, there'll be a link which says Intro to Motion Graphics 2021. If you click that image, it will take you to a Google Drive where you can download the reference image to be used in your project. Once you do that, you just drag it into After Effects. But also, if you're wondering about the colors that we're going to use, I have been using a brilliant website called coolers.co. Again, the link is in the description. You can click this Start the Generator button and it will give you a 5-color color palette every time that you press the space bar. So you can come across with some really great color palettes straight away without any design theory knowledge. You can hover over things, you click the copy hex, and that will get you the hex code. I've already created one on my account here. Intro to Motion Graphics, and this is the one that I'm going to be using throughout this project. Okay, so let's jump right into the actual motion graphics then. I'm going to go to my file explorer and I'm going to find my reference image, which I've downloaded here, as you can see. Now this is just a JPEG, or a PNG rather, that we are going to drag directly over the project window in After Effects. Now, before we get too into it, I'm going to say that if at any point during this tutorial I use a window that you cannot see, you can go up to the window box here on your toolbar and it will be somewhere in this list and you can just click that, for example, brushes, and it will bring up that panel somewhere in your interface. So don't panic if I've got a window that you can't see. So this is for complete beginners. So we're going to take this very much from scratch. The project window is where all your assets are going to be collected. And when you want to work with these assets and create something, you need to create something called a composition. So I'm just going to click this big new composition button. And we're going to make this for social media, Instagram. So we're going to make it square. I want it to be 1920 by 1920 pixels and a frame rate of 30 frames per second, which basically means 30 different pictures per second of footage. A duration of 10 seconds is going to be fine for this, and the background color of black is also fine, but I am going to rename this composition to be main. The rest of these settings you'll learn as you go. Now we are a creative tutorial channel here, so I'm not going to take you through all of the individual tools and do a boring series like that. What we're going to do is learn how to use After Effects using this project. So we're not just going to go, this is the brush tool, this is the square tool. We're going to use them in context. So just try and follow along. And by the time you finish the series, you'll be able to build and take these theories away to make your own projects. So we have our reference image. Now we have a blank composition. So we need to add stuff to that composition now. And to do that, I'm just going to drag my reference image down here into the timeline window and release. And that's just going to drop my image onto my timeline here. And you can see that I have reference.png with a little bar. And also, if I select this image in our composition window, I can drag these corners around to scale it up or down, and holding shift, I can scale it in aspect ratio. Control Z will undo whatever you've done. But you'll notice that as a reference image is not very good at the moment because our background is the wrong color. So what I'm going to do is create a solid box that's just going to sit behind that. And I'm going to hit Control Y to do that, or you can go to Layer, New, and Solid to do the same thing. White solid is fine, but we're going to call it background. It's automatically going to create it at the same size, and we're just going to hit OK. that has popped it on top of our reference image where we want it behind. So I'm just going to drag this background layer below our reference image layer like so. And you'll notice our reference image has got a little bit of a gradient on it going from white to dark gray, but don't worry about it. We'll be building all of this piece by piece. So I'm just going to grab my reference layer, and at the moment it's a little bit too visible. I want to reduce the opacity because we're only going to be using it as a reference. So I'm going to select my layer in the timeline, and I'm going to press the shortcut T, and that's going to bring up our opacity, which is see-throughness. And I'm going to say, instead of 100%, let's take it down to 10%, and that's going to make it very see-through. Using that, we're just going to lock this layer by clicking the little lock box underneath the lock icon, which means that we can't now select this layer. You can see that I'm trying to click it, but I'm actually moving the background, the solid that we've just made. So I'm going to lock both of those off, and now I can't grab or touch anything, which is great. So, okay, let's get to work. We're going to create this word intro first, which as you saw in the beginning of the animation, sort of whipped into screen, squashing and stretching and everything like that. So I'm going to press the T, the horizontal type tool in my toolbar up the top here. And I'm just going to type out the word with caps lock on, intro. Okay. And that's going to give us a piece of text that, as you can see, if you leave cap locks on, you'll get this refresh disabled. To fix that, you just press caps lock again and turn it off. You can increase this size holding shift and just position it until it's roughly the same size as the reference image. Okay. Now you'll notice that if I press R, for example, to bring up the rotation tool, I can rotate this to my heart's content. However, it rotates from this little circle in the bottom right here. So what we want to do is position that little circle in the middle. So it rotates in the middle. And to do that, you can just press Control, Alt, and Home. If you don't have a Home key button on your keyboard because it's a small one, you can choose this Pan Behind tool, which is the shortcut Y, and you can move it like that. Okay, but Control, Alt, Home, great way just to snap it into the middle. Go back to your Selection tool and open up your character window. And you'll notice that we have a fill. So the text is filled in, but there is no stroke, which is this white box with a red line through it. If we press this little swap arrow next to it, it's going to swap from fill to stroke, which basically just either fills the shape or adds a line around the edge of the shape. Okay. Now that stroke is a little bit thin, but you'll also notice that when we select this, it's still editable type, which is great, but we don't actually want it to be editable type. We want it to be shapes so that we can manipulate and squash and stretch those shapes however we like. Okay. So to do that, I'm going to right click on my intro layer. I'm going to go to create and then choose shapes from text. It's going to look like not much has happened apart from we now have a duplicated layer called intro outlines, and our original layer intro is now invisible. So on intro outlines, you can see that we can now no longer edit this text, but what we can do is change things like the thickness on the stroke. I'm going to just put it up to 2 pixels because that looks good to me. Okay. Now, we want to be able to edit these letters individually, so we can do things like change their color and other properties. So I'm just going to go to my align window and I'm going to pop it right in the middle of my screen, like so. Okay. And then we're going to grab both of these, intro and outlines, just so it's not distracting. We're going to right click them. So I just clicked and then shift clicked it there to select both layers, right click them and just choose pre-compose. Now, all this does is it's going to take those 2 layers, it's going to pop them inside their own composition. So we're going to call this intro and make sure that the second option, move all attributes, is selected. Now, we can double click on that intro layer and we are popped inside a composition with just our intro. We know it's about the same size, so it's fine. We can work on it individually. Now, if we twirl down our intro layer, you can see that we have a contents box and we can twirl that down and we have each individual letter. Now, I don't want these on the same layer because it's quite difficult to work with. We're going to separate them out to their own layers. To do that, we're just going to duplicate it a few times with Control D until we have 5 layers. That was 1 too many, so I'll just delete that. And we can just twirl down all of these again and open up the contents on each of them. On this last one, we just want the O, and then on the one before it, we just want the R, then just the T, just the N, just the I, so they're all on separate layers. To do that, I'm just going to rename them quickly by pressing Enter. Call that one O, and I'm going to select everything apart from the O and just hit delete. This one, we just want the R, so I'm going to rename that one R, and I'm going to delete everything except for the R. This one will do the T, and this one will do the N. There may be a faster way to do this, but without plugins, I haven't figured it out yet, and I don't really want to introduce plugins in this basic series. But now we have 5 layers intro, all on their same layer. And we want to put the right colors on them. So I'm just going to go back to my main composition, which you can see in the timeline here. And you can see it goes blue, red, yellow, green, blue. So back in our intro layer, we're going to go blue, and then we need red for the N. I don't think I deleted the I on the N, which I didn't. So we'll just do that. On the N, we need red. So I'm going to go to my color palette. I'm just going to click red. And with the layer selected, I'm just going to go up to stroke here and hit paste. You can work with your color libraries if you know what that is, but it's a little bit buggy in After Effects, so I choose not to. T, I believe, was yellow. And once we have these colors in here somewhere, we can just sample them from the project, so we don't need to keep tabbing out. And now that you've seen the process, I'm actually going to drag this window off onto my other screen, which you can't see, just so that I don't have to keep tabbing towards it. Just makes my life a little bit easier when it comes to clicking these colors and things like that. So we'll make that one green, and the last one again is blue. Now we need to start working on these shapes, but as you can see where we split them up, the anchor points are all the way in the wrong places. So I'm just going to select all of these layers by dragging a box, Control-Alt-Home as it does before, and that's going to pop our anchor points right in the middle of each of these, which is great. Okay, so the next step is to animate these characters. So we want to animate the position of these points on these paths, and so they can whip onto screen like so. Now to do that, we're just going to twirl down the eye icon here, twirl down the contents until we get to this icon here where it says path, and there's a stopwatch next to it. Clicking this stopwatch will add a keyframe, which is basically saying at this point in the animation, we want something to change, okay? So we're going to do that on frame 1, and we zoom in with this little handle here like so. And I'm going to move over to frame 10 by just pressing Control, Shift, and Right. So doing that with right and left will move you 10 frames. Doing that without Shift, so just Control, Left, or Right will move you 1 frame. I'm going to move over to frame 10, and we're going to keyframe again. So this will be its ending position. Okay, so we now have a start keyframe and an end keyframe. And we want a keyframe somewhere in the middle. I'm going to put it at frame 4, like so. Okay, so now we have 3 points where we want our key positions for our shape to be. If I go back to my first frame then, I can just click and drag to select all parts of my path. Now, this is important that we're editing the path at the moment. If I select my layer and I get this bounding box with the anchor point in the middle and the 9 dots around it, that's wrong for this point. We want to select this particular keyframe to give us the path elements so that when we move it, we are moving the path and not the shape itself. Now I'm just going to hold Shift and drag this guy up off screen, like so. And then I'm just going to select just the 2 top pieces here, and holding Shift, I'm going to squish him down into a little rectangle. So now we have a little rectangle that as we scrub through is growing into a big rectangle, okay? But we want this to stretch as if it is like whipping very fast. So we're just going to select just these top 2 keyframes again, but this time on our 4th frame, and holding Shift, we're just going to drag them off screen. So now we have a very long, very thin eye. So we've got a whipping into position like that, boom, boom, which looks pretty good. Apart from it looks pretty like static and not very interesting at the moment because all of our keyframes are linear, which means there's an equal amount of movement between each frame, which just doesn't look good. That's not how things move in the real world. So to fix that, we're going to add some easing to our keyframes. I'm going to select all of these keyframes here, and I'm going to press F9, which is just basically a very simple way of adding easing. You can do the same thing by clicking right-click, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. Now what this does is, it'll just make it start and end a little bit slower, and you probably won't be able to see much of a difference at this point. If you select these keyframes again and press Control whilst clicking them, they'll go back to their original form, and I'll show you this original form so that we can understand how it changes when we add easing. If you click your graph editor here, like so, it's going to take you to the same keyframes, but just with a graph view as opposed to a keyframe view. And it should look like a flat line. If you're on the value graph, for this, it will look the same, but sometimes it might look different. So you want to make sure you're on the speed graph, okay? And we've got a flat line because, like we mentioned, there is an equal amount of movement between each frames. If we select these and press F9 and go back to the same view, it looks like an M now because we've changed how much it moves during each frame. The more vertical this line is, the faster the movement. The more horizontal this line is, the slower the movement. So we can see now that it starts off with not a lot, goes into a lot of movement, and then settles in to slower movement towards the end. But it still doesn't look terribly realistic, okay? We want this to whip really fast into position, squash and hold its position when it hits the ground, and then speed up again as it bounces out of it. And you can edit that really simply by just dragging over the points of this graph here, this middle graph, and using these handles to pull your lines. Now, if vertical means fast, it's going to whip in really fast now. You can see the difference between that and that. Way loads more difference, yeah? So Control Z to redo that. So whipping into position. If we want it to sort of slow down here, we can pull this handle the other way until we get this weird wide looking M. And now, really whips into position. It looks good, yeah? Really nice. But there's a lot of energy hitting the ground here. And we kind of want the P to move and react to that energy. So I'm going to press this graph button again to go back. I'm going to select my layer and hit U just to collapse it down. And then I'm going to twirl down my eye layer contents and press P. And that's going to bring up my position keyframes, okay? And this is going to move the position of the entire object, as you can see, because we've got our bounding box back. So I'm going to go to frame 1. I'm going to keyframe the position. I'm going to press U to bring up my other frames as well, just to see what's going on. We're going to move all the way over here. We're going to wait until it hits on frame 4. We're going to give it another keyframe. And then we're going to go up to, say, frame 15 to give it a little bit of extra bounce. And we'll keyframe again there. Okay, so as it hits here, we want it to sort of punch down into the earth. So we probably don't actually need a keyframe on our first frame. So I'm going to delete that. When we move over to frame 10, say, we're going to keyframe here. And we're just going to push this guy down just a little bit. Not a lot, just by pressing shift and down. And now we have some keyframes that whip into position. It hits the floor. It overshoots just a little bit and then rebounds back into position. So, boing, looks a little bit nicer. We need to add some easing to this. Select all of those and hit F9 and go to your graph view. And we kind of want it to really rocket in with the same speed. So we'll do the same shaped M. Let's see what that looks like. Nice. Yoop. 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 That looks good. However, there's this little bit of slowdown which doesn't look good. It kind of like hesitates before it hits. So we're going to grab this first frame here and we're just going to drag that all the way out so that it's coming in with full speed. Yeah. Boom. Nice. And we'll just see if we can't get this keyframe to do the same thing. It's whipping in. Bosh. It's hitting the ground. It's going full speed already, which is great. And then it whips back into position. So let's look at that. Boop, boop, boop. Very nice. Boop, boop, boop. Boop, boop, boop. Wicked. Okie dokie. I don't like it going that way though, so let's grab these keyframes and see if we can't push it the other way. See what that looks like. That looks a bit nicer. Down and settling back in. Boop, boop, boop. Nice. That looks pretty good to me. So now we have our animated eye whipping into position. Doosh. Boosh. I could tweak here all day, but I will try not to. So now we have our animated eye, and essentially it's the same thing for the rest of the letters. So I'm going to let you do the N and the T and the O by yourself, but we're going to use the R because the R and the O have a unique feature in that they both have two shapes per layer. So on the eye layer here, if we check at this, we have one path. No matter if we press U and expand everything, under contents, there is just the one path. I, path, yeah? But on the R and the O, we actually have two paths. If we twirl these down, contents are, we have two paths for the R, one for the outside and one for the inside. And to stretch these, we're going to need to animate both of them. So we're going to go back to the beginning here. And if that's coming from the top, we'll have that from the left, this from the bottom. We'll have this one from the top as well, okay? Now, if I just grab some of these points and start stretching, it might look okay, but you can see there's like a weird little slant on the line here, and there'd be the same thing here, that much more pronounced look, which doesn't look great, okay? So we actually need to add some points to this path, and that's really easy. We're going to grab the one path, so let's start with the outer path here, and I'm just going to change this from blue guidelines by clicking this little square next to the layer, and we'll change it to something really easy to see, like red. Bit easier to see the outline points there now, for example. So we're going to select this path, and I'm going to go up to my pen tool and click it. And that allows me, if I hover over the edges of my path, you'll see there's a little plus icon. That allows me to add points to this path. And we want to add points where we're going to stretch it. So I'm going to zoom in real far, and just above the curve on this R, I'm going to add a second point there. I'm going to do the same thing on the inside of this D. And on the other side as well. So now, if we go to our selection tool, click our path, we can grab these points. And again, you can zoom in and shift click to grab individual points. We can grab these individual points and stretch it up in a much more pleasing look. Okay. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to keyframe both of these paths, press U to collapse everything down. Go to frame 4, keyframe them again. Go to frame 10, keyframe them again. Okay. Now we know that at frame 1, we want the whole shape to be off screen. At keyframe 4, we want our stretch. So we'll just select, we will just select our relative points, shift clicking them. And I'm holding space to just pan around there and holding shift to drag these elements off screen. So now I've got a super stretched R as well, whipping in, hitting the ground, shrinking down to normal. Now that we've got both of these paths, we need to select all these keyframes, hit F9, go to our graph editor, and in the middle, we need to adjust to get our M shape, and very nice. Boink. So you can see how just that little extra bit of position there adds a lot more realism and movement. So we'll do the same thing. We'll grab our R, we'll hit Shift P, and that brings up position in addition to our current keyframes. We'll keyframe at 4, at 10, and at 15. And we will adjust their position. So at frame 4, nothing. At frame 10, we want it to jump down a little bit. And let's try and line it up roughly with the amount that the eye dips to, because it's moving at the same speed and position. I accidentally had all keyframes selected there though. So it's actually changed all of them. If you can see, all 3 have changed there. So I'm just going to make sure I've just got the one keyframe selected, and I'll reposition this guy with just the arrow keys. And then I'll copy that keyframe with Control C and I'll paste it at the end. And then we've got it ducking down. Let's grab both of these. We'll check by selecting these keyframes what our speed was. So it was fully in and then fast to slow. So we'll hit F9 to give us something to work with. Go to the graph editor, reduce this guy down and this guy down, and then pull this guy all the way over. So we've got a nice dunk, exact same movement as the eye. Dunk. Very nice. Okay, so the rest of these letters are exactly the same process, but we're going to do it coming in from different angles. So let's start with the N. And I think I'll fast forward through these because they're exactly the same. But if you watch, you'll still be able to follow what I'm doing. And it also will then help you to understand the process without just copying what I'm doing, which is very important. So we're going to jump into time-lapse mode and we'll finish off the rest of these letters. Okay, so there are all 5 of our letters animated and whipping in to the beginning of to the middle of the screen there. But they're all coming in at the same time, which doesn't look great. We want them to come in sequentially. So to do that, we're going to use something called a sequencer. And we want to trim our layers so that they sequence to the amount of time that we've trimmed them. If you don't know what that means, then don't worry, we're about to find out. So, for example, if I want these to take, say, 5 frames to pop in, we're going to go to frame 4, select all our layers with shift-click, and press Alt, close square bracket, or right square bracket. And that will trim our layer at frame 5, which means that all our beautiful animation just disappears, but don't worry, we'll get there. Select I first, and then shift-click O. And then right-click that and choose Keyframe Assistant Sequence Layers. With no overlap, just hit OK. And that will basically place them one after the other at the point where our layer stopped. And if we zoom out again, we can drag the end of our layer to bring back our shapes all the way to the end of our composition. And now they start one after another and pop in and look much cooler. Boom, 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 boom. Very nice. Okay. Now, the last bit is the T that spins in and flicks the intro word up. So we're going to do that now before the T actually comes in, and then we'll use that as a way to sync things up next episode. But we now want to control all 5 letters at once, and adding a load of keyframes for position, rotation, etc., to each individual layer is very cumbersome and very difficult to change later on. So we're going to introduce something very important called a null object, and we're going to use this null object to control all of our letters. Control, Shift, Alt, and Y will add a new null object, or you can go to Layer, New, Null. And you can select this null object. And what it is an invisible layer, an invisible controller that you can use to control other things. So I'm going to reposition it to the top left of my eye, like so. And just to help with issues of scale and reference and things like that, we're going to stretch this until it covers our layers. Doesn't have to be super accurate. Like that, okay? Now we've got a box surrounding all of our layers, just for us that when we come to rotate and maybe scale things later on, we get a relative scale. So I'm now going to grab all of my layers and I'm going to collapse them down to make it easy to see. But you'll notice next to each of these layers, we have a little thing that looks like a spiral. And this is it's called a pick whip, and it's like a piece of string. And we're going to tie one of our layers to our null object layer. And what this means is wherever our null object moves, those other layers will follow. And this concept is called parent and child. The null object is your parent, the other layers are your children, and the children follow the parent. So with all those layers selected, we're just going to grab this little pick whip tool and drop it over the name null1. And you'll notice all these parents and links now go to null1, which means that if I select my null layer and move it, everything else moves with it too, which is great. Okay. So I'm then going to hit P and R, P Shift R to bring up position and rotation keyframes. And at the point where our O stops moving, which is at 1 second and 5 frames, I'm going to keyframe both of those. Okay. We want to rotate from the middle of our shape, and our anchor point is in the top left. So on our null object, we're going to hit Control, Alt, and Home, which is going to position it in the middle. I'm going to go over, say, maybe 10 frames for now, but we can edit it, doesn't matter. We're going to keyframe again, and we'll go over another 10 frames, and we'll keyframe again on both of those. On the middle set of keyframes, I'm just going to shift it up a little bit, maybe that much, and we're going to rotate it to, say, 3 or 4 degrees. Not a lot, just a little, okay? And what this basically looks like is our shapes come in, it's going to leap up as a team, and then slam back down into the earth. But as you can see, linear keyframes look rubbish, as you know by now. So we're going to select all of these, hit F9. We're going to do both of them, position and rotation. So you can see we get 2 paths now, one for position and one for rotation. We want it to jump really quickly as if it's been hit by something. So we're going to select both of these points, and we're editing position and rotation here. And we're going to drag that handle away. This handle we're going to drag all the way over to the left. And this one, we want it to slam into position. So we're going to drag that all the way over to the right and all the way over to the right as well. So we get this really extreme bosh, hangs in the air for ages and then slams back down. Okay. So let's look at that. Looks nice. But what I want to do is adjust this rotation so that it jumps in the air, but it starts to tilt back down just a little bit earlier. So to do that, we're just going to move just this one rotation keyframe over. And you'll notice it's going to start to spin just a little bit before it starts to move back down. So, boom, 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 boom. Just gives it a little bit more realism to its movements. I might add another 5 frames by moving these keyframes. I can click and drag them, or I can press Alt left and right to move selected keyframes and Alt Shift left and right to move them 10 frames in the same way that we navigate. Doing that 5 times will give us 5 frames of movement. And that just lets it hang in the air a little bit longer. Boom. And that will look much cooler when we've got our 2 intro 2, when we get the 2 spinning around and hitting that. Also, as they come down, just for the hell of it, let's have some of our letters, the N and the R, for example. Let's shift click both of them, go to our position keyframes. And if we just go over those 15 frames again, let's just have them finish a little bit higher up. And see what that looks like. Looks nice, apart from they fall too quickly because the easing isn't correct. So we're just going to select those easings and we're just going to drag them over so that they end in the same position. Or at the same speed. Great. Okay. That looks pretty good. We may come back and add some more details to this later on when we're talking about expressions, but for now we're going to leave it there. Okay. So like earlier, I'm going to press Tab to bring up my composition flowchart. And that basically means that we are inside the intro composition, which is inside the main composition. So if I click main, it will take us back to main. And you'll notice now that we are in our ending position, like so, for our to match it up with our original. So I'm just going to grab this intro comp. We're going to move it into position. And you'll notice that this one is on a bit of a wonk. So we'll bring up our rotation keyframes with R and we'll give it a rotation of 3. And we can zoom in and just reposition this perfectly. If it's a little bit big, you can just scale it down because we're using a pre-comp, which means this won't affect any of the animation that we've done. And we can just line that up until we're happy. Okay. What this does mean, however, you'll notice is that some of our animation takes place off screen, but that's fine. And some of it pops in on screen as well, if that makes sense. Like here, the edge of our composition. No one will notice. Boop, 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 in motion. But if you want to fix that, you can go inside your composition, right click, choose composition settings and make it way bigger. Let's make it 3840 by 3840. Hit OK. Now that's given us loads more space. Yeah. And you can go to the point where the T is broken, for example. Press U to bring up your keyframes. And on the first frame here, you could then just drag. Oh, excuse me, if I select the path, you could then just drag that off screen and go back to a main comp and you'll see that there it's now starting off screen when it whips into position. It starts way lower. I think that is overkill. I'm going to undo all of that and we'll just reposition it. Okay. Boom, 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 boom. I don't think it matters. If you think it matters, great. Use it. We're going to carry on with making our animation today. What we've done so far is this kind of whip stretched text effect on the intro. And today we're going to learn about motion paths and animating with realism as we add the T and O in the intro tube for this next section. So without any further ado, we'll just jump right into it. So to start off with, we need to obviously add our text. So I'm going to grab my text tool and just click and type in the word to. Now you can use whatever your font you'd like, but if you're following along, obviously you need to use Futura PT, like I mentioned before. Control, Alt, and Home will place our anchor point within the middle of our letters, and we're just going to place them over until they roughly line up with our guide layer that we used in the last episode. And that looks pretty good to me. I'm just going to swap out the fill in my character window so that we have a blue fill and no stroke. And I think the fill we used for the O was yellow, so we can just grab that from our color palette, which I moved off screen last episode, if you remember, and we can just paste that in like so. Now, this is going to have a very similar process to the previous episode. We're going to right click and pre-comp, and we'll name this one 2. And that's just going to create a composition that we can drop inside and we can animate the 2 individually from the rest of the work. Doing it this way allows us to know that the T is currently in its perfect finishing positions. When we animate it later on, we don't have to worry about that. I'm going to right click that layer and just use create shapes from text like we did before. And we're going to leave the original layer invisible We're also going to do the same thing we did before, which duplicate it with Control D and just separate out the T and the O onto their own layers by twirling down, selecting the ones we don't want and deleting them. Now, we're not actually going to be using this T letter shape. We're going to be rebuilding it, but we will be using the O. So I'm just going to hide the O for now because we'll work on the T first. And I'm going to reduce the opacity of this T down to 20. And I'm just going to lock the hidden text layer as well as the T and O layers because we're only using those for reference. Now, if we zoom in, we're going to grab our rectangle tool from the toolbar up here, and you can long press on that if it doesn't look like a rectangle, if it looks like a circle. Long press on the circle and click the rectangle tool. Holding Alt, I'm going to click until the stroke disappears and there's just a red line through it. And we're going to check that this is the correct blue, which it is, I believe. Yes, so we can hit OK. Then I'm going to zoom in as closely as I can. And if you're having trouble seeing, you can turn the background to a checkerboard, it might help. And we're going to click and drag until we draw a rectangle that is the height and width of the full stem of our T. Going back to our selection tool, we can click that again and press Ctrl Alt Home to ensure that the anchor point is in the middle of our shape. Okay, now we have this part of the T ready. We're going to wait until we form the crossbar until a little bit later. I'm going to choose Fit in View, and I'm going to collapse that layer with the U key, and I'm going to rename it T Stem. Oops, or I'm going to rename it T St apparently. T Stem, there we go. Now, we need to draw a path for the whipping motion that we want the T to follow. So to do that, I'm just going to grab my pen tool with no layer selected. I'm going to Alt click the fill until there's a red line through it. And then zooming out, I'm just going to draw myself a path that forms a big spiral with the pen tool by clicking and dragging and holding Shift if you want a perfect angle. By just clicking and dragging, you can use these handles to pull your shape into position. And I'm just going to finish it right beneath where our T rectangle starts. Okay, so now we just have an empty path that's in a spiral. Now, you can select these individual points by just clicking and dragging and using the handles and dots to reposition until you get a nice smooth spiral that you're happy with. Okay, I think I want my spiral to come in like this, but it might be nice if it starts off screen. If you want to add handles to a point, you can Alt click it, and that will give you a handle to work with, which allows you to change things like trajectory. And just tweak that until you get a spiral that you're vaguely happy with. I think I'm happy with that. Now, we are going to use something called Create Path from Nulls, which is a built-in script, in order to create a null object, which if you remember is just an empty object with no content, that's going to follow the path of this line, and then we're going to attach our rectangle to that path. So to do that, you're going to need to go to Window and make sure that you have Create Nulls from Paths open. Selecting that will open up this window for you here. We are going to twirl down our path layer, which we will just rename to Path, until we have the keyframeable layer of the path selected, and then we're going to click Trace Path. What that's going to do is create a null object, as you can see here, and if we press U on that null object, it will bring up all the keyframes, and you'll notice that it's already created 2 keyframes for us, one at the start of the path and one at the end of the path. Now, it's already taking a second to move, which is totally fine, but we want to animate it in a cool way. At the moment, it's very linear. So what we're going to do first is attach our object. Now, go to the last keyframe of your path, and you'll notice that the null object point will line up with that last point. It's very important that you do this at this keyframe so that it aligns correctly. But you're then just going to grab your T stem, which I like to put above the path because that just makes sense to my brain. And we're going to pick whip or parent it to the trace path at that keyframe. The reason we do it at that keyframe is that then it will follow that path perfectly all the way through its animation. Okay. If, for example, you did it halfway through, when you parent, it will parent it at that point, and then obviously that looks completely incorrect. Okay, so go to the last keyframe and then parent to your path. Now, this path just has the movement, and we want it to sort of whip into position and then speed up at the end. So we're just going to start by just going to F9, select both those keyframes and drag it out. Let's see what that looks like. not great. Yeah, kind of whips super fast in and then kind of slams into position. So we're going to definitely want to reduce the last keyframe so that it really does whip. We want it to go quite slowly until about here and then speed up quite a bit. Okay. So before we do that and before we refine this much further, we also wanted to make it look like this object is very close to the camera and then it disappears by getting, well, not disappears, it scales down by moving further away from the camera. To do that's very easy. We're just going to press Scale S on our T stem layer and keyframe that at the open and the close. So at 0 seconds and at 1 second. And we're going to go back to the first one and we're going to just scale up. Scale up as much as you want. Then you can see it's going to start to make a little bit more sense. Like so. You'll also notice that now that we have an object attached to it, we can see that it's going to loop forever, which is no good. We only want it to loop once. To do that, you go down to your trace path and twirl down everything. And then under the progress, where it says expression progress, you can just select all of that and delete it. That will allow your animation to go once and no further. Okay. 1 second seems pretty short. I'm going to Alt Shift and right until we get to 2 seconds. And automatically that gives us a lot more time to work with, which is great. I'm going to grab all of my keyframes, the scale and the progress keyframes. I'm going to hit F9 to give them an easy ease, effectively undoing what we've just done. And I'm going to find a point where I really want it to speed up, which is probably going to be about here. And then I'm going to keyframe again. So selecting these keyframes and control clicking them will just turn them back to normal keyframes, effectively undoing the speed ramping that we just did, just to test things. Then if you hit F9 on them, it will add the easy ease in and go to your graph. It should look like this. If you've got the other graph that looks like that, then you're on the speed graph and you need the, you're on the value graph and you need the speed graph. It should look like an M and a W. We essentially would like this to go fast, or rather slowing in, hovering at the top here, and then speeding up again. And with easy ease, it kind of does that, but it doesn't look great. Okay. And that's because we want it to whip into position. So we already know how to do that by just dragging to go fast or slow. Boom, boom, looks quite nice. And then this one, we want to whip fully into position and completely have no speeding out so that it really does like woof, slam into there. Maybe we can leave a little bit of it in depending on what we think. That looks nicer. Okay. So with that in mind, we've got this point where it hesitates and we really don't want it to stop. So to do that, we're going to move to the value graph. Selecting all your keyframes, go to the value graph. And you'll see that horizontal movement is no movement in this. And we can go to our scale and select that individually, and our progress and select that individually, or we can do what we usually do, which is just select both to see both. Now, if we wanted to maintain a little bit of speed, it's very simple. We just need to drag these points until they are linear, i.e. there is a level amount of motion. And you'll notice that the scale, the position hasn't been done yet, but the scale continues where the position has stopped. If we do the same thing to the position, we can get a really minute level of detail where it slows down, but it doesn't stop at all. And now, boom, looks good. However, 2 seconds, far too long. 1 second wasn't enough, 2 seconds was far too long. But I think I've got the perfect amount of time. If you notice back in our intro setting, we had at 1 second and 5 frames, bosh, it starts to jump up. That's when we want it to end, exactly. So we'll go to 2 and we'll alt drag this until it reaches there. That's going to maintain all of the easing we've just done. It's just going to speed everything up until it reaches the point we want. Boom. Okay. So it looks a bit stilted still, and that's just because at the moment we haven't really controlled it with a great amount of detail. For example, at this point, I want it to be much smaller than it is. So I'm just going to scale this down. We kind of want it to be pretty much at its finishing size. Great. The other reason is because the rotation isn't overshooting as it spins. If this object were actually rotating out like this, the back of it might spin out a little bit. So we're going to hit Shift R with our T stem layer selected to bring up the rotation keyframes. And as it whips into position here, we might add a keyframe, have it spin out slightly by just moving forward a few frames. Moving forward a few frames. And every time there's a hard corner, just overshoot the rotation ever so slightly. Boom. Especially if we keyframe here and right before we have it properly whip into position before making its way back to 0 or 90, I suppose. Boom. Now let's look at that. It's a little bit nicer. Let's also take our scale at this point, unlink it, keyframe that, and right before it slams into position, let's have it be longer because of the speed that it's moving. That looks much nicer already. I think as well, the path is a little bit extreme, or rather not extreme enough. So we're going to grab our path with the pen tool, and we're just going to tweak out to get an extra bit of spin and overshoot, you'll see there. And don't worry that it's not matching up to our original. We will fix that, because it's going to continue to spin in that direction. So really what we could do is actually have it start and finish like that. Perfect. Okay. So we have our spinning block coming in like so. And we also have the ghost layer of our teeth where we want this to finish up. So at this point, I'm just going to collapse all my layers and press U until just the keyframes come up. And then with the T stem selected, I'm going to hit Control-Shift-D to split that layer. Now, if I press U, it's actually duplicated. It's all those previous keyframes are there, but if you want to be neat, you can just delete them. We don't need them for now. Okay. Now, at this point, we've probably noticed that the line has slipped off a little bit. So I'm just going to take my path keyframe once again, where it finishes, and we're just going to reposition just so that it looks central. Just that last point, not the whole thing, just the last point. And then here, bam, perfect. Okay. So this is still linked to the path, which is great. Apart from we don't need that anymore. So I'm just going to disconnect from the trace path. And if you want to, you could also split Control-Shift-D, the null object, just so that visually in your timeline, you can see that it's we're finished with it. Now we want this to keep spinning and then drop into position. So position, definitely. Let's keyframe that. Let's have it move 15 frames. And then another 15 to go back to its original position. And in the middle, let's have it move up like so. Selecting all these keyframes, hit F9 to give them an easy ease. Go to your value editor or graph editor. Make sure you're on speed graph. And because it's just whipped out of this massive spiral, we want it to go super fast at the beginning. So we'll remove all influence from the start and add all influence to the end. Boom. Very nice. So you can already see how this might look. Pretty good. Apart from we want to have it settle into position with a smack. So we'll give loads of influence at the start and reduce some at the end. Boom. Very nice. Okay. So that is the position. That looks totally fine. Let's look at the whole thing. I think I'm happy with that. It's a bit long at the end there. Perhaps we stretched that scale a bit too much. But don't worry, we'll leave some of it, maybe 120%, because we'll be stretching this scale as it spins as well, which is actually the next step. So Shift S on that layer to increase the scale. That needs to be at 120. It's going to rotate, 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 and it's going to stop, let's say at the beginning about here. So we'll put that down to 100, 100 here. That'll make more sense when we add the rotation. Shift R with the layer selected adds a rotation keyframe. Go all the way to the end. And let's say it spins out 2 full rotations. So we click this first number here and type in 2. So 2 full rotations plus it'll have to land perfectly upright. So let's just zero that out. So now we've got the object spinning, but it's spinning in the wrong direction. It's going to flick into position here and then start spinning the wrong way. So we actually want to make sure that that is -2. So it's now going to spin dunk, and land. Looks okay, but again, now we can fix the scale once we've fixed the speed of the rotation. So we're going to grab those 2 rotation keyframes, hit F9, and you guessed it, it's going to go from super fast to super slow. I don't know if we can remove all the influence. Yeah, we should definitely remove all the influence. Bam, that looks pretty nice. Boom, 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 bosh. And the scale kind of works already. But there'll be a point if you go to your graph editor where a drastic amount of speed has been reduced, somewhere around here. And at that point, I'd say is where we want the scale to roughly end. So we'll just F9 those. Boom. Nice, very nice. Okay, so let's look at that. Boom. Looks nice. Apart from I do want it to slam down a bit harder, so I'm just going to grab those position keyframes again, and I am going to remove all of that influence because when it slams, we want it to squash and stretch to compensate. It's much easier to squash and stretch something and keep it in place if your anchor point is at the bottom of the shape. So we are once again going to split this layer, Control-Shift-D, U to bring up all the keyframes and just delete them all to make it nice and clean. Then we can move our anchor point down to the bottom of the shape. We can just grab our pan behind tool from up here in the toolbar, and holding Shift, we can just click and drag on that anchor point until we position it roughly at the bottom of the shape. From there, just some simple scale keyframes. So scale once, we'll go forward, say 10 frames. And we know we're at 100, 100. So we can just squash and stretch this to our heart's content. Go forward 10 frames. Stretch it up, making sure it's taller and thinner because we want to make it look like it's maintaining the same amount of mass. We'll have it squash and stretch just a little bit again. And then return to 100, 100, which is the shape of our original T. Hit F9 on all those keyframes, and we've got something that looks like this, which looks a bit rubbish. So again, really has to influence its scale, coming out super fast. Boom. And that looks kind of okay. But you need to remember that there's energy. So it's squash, it's going to hold at the bottom, then it's going to shoot up a little bit, and that's going to continue, but dissipating slightly each time. So you'd want to grab and add just a little bit of influence one way. Grab, add that same amount of influence back the other way. And then for the final one, you can add just a touch of influence both ways. Like so. And then that looks kind of okay like that. So let's drop back here and take a look. That looks pretty nice. Okay. So I'd say that's that part of the shape. I'm happy with it for now. I'm going to go to my last keyframe so that it's in perfect position, perfect size. And I'm just going to collapse everything like that. I will leave this with U so that I can see where my last keyframe is. And then on a new shape layer, I'm going to get myself a copy of the same blue with fill and no stroke. I'm going to come in and I'm going to trace. There's a slight upward tilt in my font. It might not be the same for you, so I'm going to add that in. I'm going to trace the outline of that T and line it up so that all the subpixeling looks fine. And that's probably close enough since it's quite small, you'll never be able to tell. And then pressing open square bracket, I'm going to position the start of this layer here, like so. Using my pan behind tool, I'm just going to link or move the rotation point up to the top left of this T part here. And we're basically going to have this part swing out of the T. So we're going to take our rotation tool, keyframe that, rotate by 90 degrees, or just enough to hide it. So 61 degrees. Move forward 10 frames. And we're going to overshoot it a little bit by just scaling that up. Undershoot it again a little bit. And then bring it back to nil. Now, you'll notice that at some point, the top of its arc, you may need to adjust its path. Just extend that so that it covers at all points. And don't worry too much about it poking out the other side because we're going to actually just trim that single frame off because it doesn't really matter. Let's grab all those and hit F9. You know the deal by now. We want it to go fast, into not so fast, into not so fast. Boing. That looks pretty good. Boing. Like so. Lovely. Now, at the very end, again, at the very end, we're going to pick whip that to our stem. And the reason we do this is because we're going to offset it in a moment. But first, I'm going to duplicate this layer with Control D, right click it, choose Transform, Flip Horizontal. And that's going to fill in the other end of our T here. May have to just bring it out just a little bit. Like so. So we get a perfect T. And now all we need to do is flip these rotation values, because obviously the rotation value needs to be negative 61 rather than positive 61. That needs to be positive 11 as opposed to negative 11. That needs to be negative 9 as opposed to positive 9, and 0 is 0. It doesn't matter. So now we've got two sides of the T popping out like so. And kind of doesn't matter that they flop down and reveal the top of that T. I'm happy with that. It's how it would actually be. That's fine. And now what we're going to do, because we pinned them after all the movement was finished, if we just move these back by selecting them both and choosing open square bracket, they will be scaled and connected to the movements of the T. So they too will squash and stretch with the T, which means as the T comes down and these things flip out, they're going to react and come up, which is a form of secondary motion, which looks very good. Looking at the whole thing. Nice. Let's press Tab to go up to our main composition. And we'll see how now it looks like the T boom, swings in and knocks the word intro up. Perfecto. Okay. May just tweak the beginning of these T's. See what it looks like there. That looks nicer actually a bit earlier, doesn't it? Very nice. Okay, cool. So that is the T finished, which is great. So let's move on to the O. We're going to make our O layer visible and unlock it, because this is the layer that we're actually going to be doing the editing on. No sneaky duplicate shapes this time. Control-Alt-Home will place this at the center of the O, which is quite important. But because we're going to want to make this bounce, we're going to grab our pan behind tool, and holding Shift, we're just going to position it at the bottom of our O. So now we're going to use similar techniques for this O, but it's on a symbol. It's on a single shape, so it's much easier. We're going to grab our position. In fact, let's make it drop in at 105. So we'll just open square bracket there and keyframe our position. Let's have it take 15 frames to hit the floor. And we're just going to go back to our first frame and drag it off screen. On our second frame, it's going to hit the floor. Let's have it go 10 frames. Oh no, let's say 15. Keep things even. And have it raise up. But then there's less space for it to travel in less energy, so 10 frames should be fine. And we will just copy this original keyframe there. Another 10, or that's 20 frames, sorry, my mistake. Another 10 frames, and we'll have it come up slightly less. Another 10 frames, it hits the floor, just pasting that keyframe. Another 10 frames, it comes up slightly less. And another 10 frames, paste the keyframe. Another 10 frames, even less. And another 10 frames, paste the keyframes. Now we have a very boing, 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 rubbish looking bouncy ball. Let's grab all of those and hit F9. And we want this one to just come rocketing up in speed. So it's going to start dropping. And with gravity, obviously, it doesn't slow down as it reaches the end of its arc. So we need to make sure there's absolutely no influence there. So it's just completely speeding up. And then here, what we're probably going to do is grab both of these arcs. Maybe not 100% influence, but we'll see. Let's drag it up to, say, 85% influence either side. Or thereabouts. See what that looks like. Looks a bit weird. Boing. Boing. Yeah, that looks a bit strange. So let's drag it a touch down again. Say around 50% influence for these until it starts to slow down. Like this. Okay, that looks kind of okay. Boing. I think this needs much less than the start because it should be rocketing out. As it reaches the top of its arc, it should hover there for a bit. So we will pull this one out as well so that it hovers slightly. It's going to hover in the air. It's going to keep speeding up, which means there's going to be no influence or very little influence towards the end. Then it's going to rocket into the air. Again, at the next keyframe, it's going to hover. So we'll add a little bit of influence there. It's going to hover in there, so we don't want it to drop too fast. So we'll drag up the influence. As it drops towards the ground, there'll be barely any influence before it hits. Here, we want the same thing. We want it to be slightly faster, moving out of its influence, hanging in the air, dropping into no influence. And then the last two are so slight that you can probably just get away with it. Almost. You can see it gets a bit floaty towards the end. And that's because we haven't adjusted this influence well enough. So if you hold Alt, you can zoom in, which makes your keys a little bit easier to see. And you can see where the issue is. It slows down as it hits there. So we need to remove that influence. This influence hangs in the air as it rockets up a little bit. Boom. And then as it hits, there'll be barely any influence. So Alt again to zoom out. Very nice. So those are the position keyframes. We now need to add squash and stretch to this as it falls. So we're going to have Shift S on this layer to bring up scale. And we're going to do this in a very similar way. We're just going to go straight ahead on this one. As it drops, you can see the dots on your line here, which make it easy to see where the speed starts to slow down. We're going to have it be unlinked scale, and we're just going to stretch the height just loads. Because at this point, you can see it's moving half the distance in a single frame. By the next frame, we're just going to squash it down and make it wider. And you'll notice that on the first keyframe, I haven't done any editing, and that's so I can just copy paste it. It's not really, because it's going to speed up as it starts to drop. It's not really going to stretch until about here, maybe here. So we'll copy this first keyframe and paste it. That means it's going to drop, stretch and hit. By about here, we'd like it to squash and stretch the other way, and you can just grab these handles, and it's going to start to slow down around here. So again, we'll keyframe that, move to where we think it's reaching the apex of its arc, and we'll squash it back into a regular-ish shape. It's going to start to drop again and speed up, which means we need another keyframe. As it speeds up, we're going to need a few more shapes. And this isn't as extreme because it's lost a lot of its energy on the first bounce. Squash and stretch it in the other direction. As it moves back up into the air, let's go one frame further. We want to squash and stretch it the other way. It's going to start to slow down again. So we kind of want it to go back to its original shape. In fact, maybe we could even just paste it. You can see how otherwise you get a little bit of creep. You can see it scales up. So let's look at that. So we can see actually there we overscaled quite a lot. You can see that massive drop. And that is an issue with working straight ahead, is that you will get this creep, this scale creep, which is why it's good to basically check your work. I think that needs to move forward a bit. As it drops through the air here, we just want a little bit because it's lost so much energy now. We're just going to stretch it one way. It's going to hit the floor. We'll keyframe that. On the next frame, we'll just squash and stretch it the other way. It's going to rise into the air. Let's paste back the original size. And then I think we're done. Maybe on this bounce, we'll have a final tiny bit of squash and stretch. By just boing, like that. Okay, let's take a look. That looks okay. Let's see what that looks like in context by going tab back to our main and taking a look. Perfecto. Okay, one thing I did like, however, about this is that you could see through it in the original. And to do that, I literally just went to 2, the layer, went to the layer mode, and just change it to multiply. And that allows you to see through. And when we add this motion block in the next episode, it's going to look even better because it kind of cuts the O in half. If I just hide these originals here, and you can see what I mean when I talk about that kind of half cut in color look there. So let's take a look at what we've done so far. Looks pretty good. Okay. Last step then is to go back inside this 2 layer and to just hide the original T like that. And there you have it. Really great shape manipulation with basic scale, rotation, position, keyframes. Really core fundamental theory behind motion graphics there is this theory of animation and weight and feeling and motion. And you get that by just taking your time, doing it one step at a time. Do the position keyframes, come back and do the scale keyframes, come back and do the rotation keyframes, etc. Have a go, see if you can't replicate this. And I look forward to the next episode where we can do some really fun stuff with masks and a little bit of expressions as well. Hello everybody and welcome back to TipTut and welcome back to Intro to Motion Graphics 2021. So far we have created the intro in 2 words or whatever words is that you're using during this, and we've explored animating paths, positional scale, rotation, keyframes, all the basic stuff that you need to get started with motion graphics. In this episode we're going to do something a little bit more complicated, but not too much, so don't panic. We'll be starting off with this section here where the shapes pop into view. The word motion appears and fades away, all very simple. And then we're going to start exploring masks and layer effects in this tutorial here, where the word motion pops up, and then there's this red bar in the background. So nothing too scary, but it will be exploring effects and masks and things like that. So starting to get into the nitty gritty of what After Effects is all really about for motion graphics. So back in our main composition, we're going to turn on our reference layer, and we're just going to start nice and simply by grabbing the text tool and creating the word motion. Oops, excuse me. Let's position it in place because the anchor point's on the bottom right there, and turn caps lock off so we can see what we're doing. And we'll just position that word motion where we need it and press Ctrl-Alt-Home to place that anchor point in the middle. And with the shape tool selected and with no layers selected down here, that's the important part, we're going to, I'll just eyedropper this yellow to save time. We'll just drag out a rectangle that is roughly the same size. Boom, pretty good. Let's turn off our reference layer again, and we'll just rename this layer a rectangle. And we'll press Ctrl, open square bracket to push it below our text layer. Then selecting both of these, we'll just right click and choose pre-compose like we did before. And we'll just call this one motion. Then double click to go inside. And we've got our motion text layer, which I'll just make white so we can see it. And our rectangle in the background. Using these, we can sort of use them as the base work for the rest of our animation for this section. So step 1 is to do what we did previously before, which is to take our text layer here and using my color palette, which again, I've just got off screen here in Intro to Motion Graphics. I'm just going to change each one of these letters into their own color. And you can do this by just selecting the text tool, highlighting a single layer and choosing that color on that, highlighting a single character and choosing that color on the character. I'm just going to copy the blue again. Like I said before, you can use libraries for this, but I've had trouble with libraries. It doesn't always select the right thing. So I've just got my color palette website open that I showed you in the first episode. For now, I'm just going to hide this background rectangle layer because it's not what we need at the moment. So the first thing we had with these shapes popping up one by one before the word motion just faded in and out. This is actually a really deceptively simple thing to do. I'm going to sample with my shape tool selected, the blue on this M, and we're just going to create a shape that is closest to the overall shape of the letter. In this case, just a rectangle. The O, even simpler, is just going to be a circle. So we'll go to the ellipse tool, we'll sample the red. I'm going to go to the center of the shape and holding Control and Shift, we can draw a circle that grows from the center. And we'll just line that up. The T again is going to be a rectangle, nice and simple. And between each shape here, I am deselecting the previous layer so that it is drawing each shape on its own layer. So you can see here, deselect. So we could rename these M, O, T. I'm just going to duplicate this shape for the eye with Control D, and then my selection tool, just hit OK there. Scale this down by unlinking the constrained proportions so I can just scale the width. Just place that over the eye. May as well duplicate the O as well. Place that over the other O. Choose blue. And for the N, we can go ahead and duplicate the M, rename it N, and pop it over here. One thing that might be nice is if we were to split this rectangle to make it more obvious that it's supposed to be an N. And to do that, we're going to work with a mask. So I'm going to select my N layer. I'm going to select my pen tool and make sure that I'm selected on the Tool Creates Mask option up here at the top of the toolbar. And we're just going to go slightly below our corner point here. Holding Shift, we can create a perfect diagonal line. Let's draw a triangle over that portion of the shape and it will create a mask for that portion of the shape, which we can then select the whole layer, duplicate it, press R to bring up our rotation and rotate that 180 degrees to bring the shape up to the other corner. And we can then tweak its position like so. That in mind, let's hide the text layer underneath so we can see what we end up with. That's a little bit close. So I think I'm going to increase the gap between those two layers here. And then pressing S, I'm just going to scale those down so that it's a little bit more tweaked. I'm then going to just adjust the position between these until they're equal. And selecting all of them, we'll just press U to collapse all the layers. Now let's go forward, say 3 frames for each. 1, 2, 3. And then press Control Shift D to split all of those layers and delete the remaining. So they only exist for 3 frames each. Same thing we did in the previous lesson. We can then select all these layers, do a right click, and go to Keyframe Assistant Sequence Layers. Sorry, I'm having trouble speaking this morning. Press Enter on that and that will sequence all of these. Boop, 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 boop. Now we get our nice popping. These two, however, we want them to appear at the same time. So I'm just going to drag those 2 N shapes over the top of each other. Perfect. I am going to shift this over 3 frames. 1, 2, 3, just so that we've got 3 frames at the start and it all appears at the same sequence. The next step is to grab our motion, the word motion, very simple here. And I'm moving quite quickly because this is such a simple thing that we've explored in previous tutorials. Keyframe the opacity with the shortcut T. Do it again 10 frames later. That was Control Shift right. Again, let's then reduce the first and last keyframes to 0. Just like it's loading the motion. Perfect. Let's again Control Shift D to split this layer. And for the sake of our sequencing in our heads, we can just split that above it. And we'll take the rectangle and Control or close square bracket to push that up, and just open square bracket to push the start of the layer over to where our playhead is. Now, with that in mind, let's turn on the rectangle layer and let's take a look at what our previous animation did. The shape kind of pushed itself upwards or scaled itself upwards, and the word motion popped from its original position down from the top, but masked out by the rectangle. That's fairly simple to do. The first thing is to take your anchor point of your rectangle and move it down to the bottom of the shape. So we'll use our pan behind tool and we'll just click and drag that until it's aligned with the bottom of the rectangle. And we can take the scale property here with S, keyframe that, let's say 30 frames, keyframe it again. We want it to end up in this position, so we'll go back to the first keyframe and just shift that down. Oh, excuse me, that was position, not scale. We're not doing position yet. We're doing scale first. So we'll unlink that and reduce the height down to 0. We'll then Shift P the position and keyframe that. And go back to the first keyframe and just push it down a little bit too. That just gives us a nice little extra bit of motion as it shifts its way upwards. Although linear keyframes we know are rubbish, so we'll hit F9 on that, go to our graph editor and just drag these final points here so we get a nice eased speed. There we go, much nicer. If we take our motion layer, which we can see at the moment is on top, but currently all yellow. Is that correct? No, sorry, currently at opacity 0. We'd want this to be opacity 100, so we can just delete all those keyframes. But we only want this shape to appear where the yellow rectangle appears if we look at our original here, like so. Additionally, it's also allowing or is showing through the background color. So we want to make sure we can do that as well. Let's go back to our motion composition here. And I'm just going to make it white now just to make things a bit easier. And with the rectangle layer selected, we can go to toggle switches / modes. And there will be an icon on one of these screens under the track matte column. And we can choose alpha matte motion 2, but we want the inverted one. What this means is this layer will only appear where the motion layer isn't, if that makes sense. So alpha matte would make the motion layer only visible when it's in the confines of the rectangle layer. But the invert is the opposite. This layer disappears when it is in the confines of the rectangle layer and makes it kind of a cutout, which is exactly what we want. Let's go to our finish position, keyframe the position of the motion layer, back to the start position, and just shift it up so that it slides in like so. Again, F9 on those. Drag this one over. Boom. Nice. Of course, this is only very simple motion at the moment. You could add as much or as little nuance to this as you'd like. But we've learned about masking using track mats. We've learned about sequencing and splitting layers. And now we're going to learn about layer effects. So the final thing that happens in this example here is this red object that scales up from the center and has this, if we zoom in, kind of a animated rough edge to the shape, for want of a better word. Let's go back to our composition. This is very easy to make. We're just going to grab our rectangle tool, or if you wanted to, you could just duplicate this rectangle, but we'll draw a new one. We'll grab our rectangle tool and we'll just make a rectangle that covers the word motion, and we'll push it below those other two layers. And we'll make the start of it begin where our playhead begins. Let's go to scale keyframes. Let's unlink them again. Go for a full second and we'll scale it up from 0 to 100, the same as we did with the yellow rectangle. But on the second keyframe, instead of 100, we'll just drag it so that it only fills a portion. And because we haven't put any position keyframes, we can reposition this however we like to fill the exact center of that motion text. Now, at the moment, this scale looks fine. Let's add some easing to the keyframes, exactly the same as it did before. Should be second nature by now. Scales up, perfect. But it doesn't look nice because we haven't added the roughen edges to it like we did in the example. So going up to our effects and presets panel, give it a second for all the effects to load. There we go. And we are going to type in roughen edges. When you have that roughen edges in your palette, just drag that down to your layer. And you probably won't notice much at first because it's very subtle, but you can see that some of these edges have started to bend and warp out of shape. If you press Ctrl-Shift-H, it will hide all of your guides and shape layer edges, which allows you to see things like this a bit easier. And Ctrl-Shift-H again will bring that back. I'm going to increase the border of my shape a whole bunch. Also increase the edge sharpness to make those edges sharper. And the fractal influence needs to remain at 1. The scale, however, we want to crunch all the way down to its lowest factor, which gives us this kind of animated noise effect, which is nice. And the stretch will leave it by itself. Complexity, however, will also turn up. Now, it's important you do this on your final keyframe or at any point past it. But once you've cranked everything like that up to the top, you play with the border in order to see how much of the edge you really want that to affect. Look at it at roughly 100% to get the perfect amount. I'm going to say about 50 works well here. These edges are a little bit crunchy for my taste though. So you can filter through some of these like roughen color to see which ones you prefer the look of. Perhaps rusty. Rusty looks quite nice, but it does extend quite far. I think I'll stick with roughen, the first one, and just increase that crunch. And you'll also notice that this isn't animated. Okay, it stays at that style of roughen once the shape finishes moving. And we're just going to use a very simple expression to animate this. You'll notice if we twist this evolution dial, it animates. And we could just go to the start of our layer, place a keyframe, go to the end of our layer, place another keyframe, and say like 10 times. Yeah. But what if we come to extend this later on? Yes, that works. And it does crinkle, but that's 2 keyframes that we again have to worry about if and when we come to modify this composition. So instead I'm going to alt click, so hold alt and click this evolution keyframe, which opens up the expression window for that specific thing. Very simple, time, and then asterisk, which is the calculator command for times, as in, 4 times 5 or whatever. Time times, let's put 50 in there, see what happens. And then a semicolon to close that line of code. All this means is over time, at a rate of 50, animate this element. Now it is animating, but it's very slow, if you can see. So we don't want 50. Let's try something drastic like 500. Much better. Now this will animate forever and ever until we choose to stop it with another expression. Okay. So boop, 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 pops up like that. Let's take a look at our original file. I think that is the last thing that shape does. Yes, indeed. So let's pop back to our main composition. We have our shape here. However, we want it to be below this 2 layer because the 2 layer has a multiply on it. And if we check our reference, it's slightly off position wise. So we can fix that by just tweaking until we're happy. That looks better to me. Let's hide our reference and choose its starting point. So do we want it to start straight away? Let's see what that looks like. That looks pretty good to me, actually, at that timing. So I think that looks pretty good. All right. So in this episode, we learned a little bit about track masking. We learned a little bit about effects layers and things like that. And we learned about, well, we continue to learn about pre-composition, which is what's going to be very important in our next lesson, because in the next lesson, we'll be exploring this graphics section here, where all of these layers come in individually, rotate into place, find their position. But you'll notice that each of them has the same interior pre-comp, i.e. different parts of the same pre-composition. So this is where we basically turn everything that we've learned in these previous lessons and place it into this final section. Hello everybody and welcome back to Intro to Motion Graphics 2021 and to TipTut. We're going to carry on with our lesson today. We've created this stuff so far, which looks pretty good, to be honest. But now we're on to probably the most complicated part of the animation. That's this graphics section here. As you can see, if I double click my all footage and just scrub through it, when we have our graphics appear, that is the word graphics as well as the visual graphics, it comes in sections. These sections come together. There's spinning elements inside those sections. The letters spin. Then there's this Venetian blinds kind of effect behind the text as well. And excuse me, I just dragged the wrong timeline there. and the letters themselves also wiggle. So there's quite a lot going on here, but deceptively simple because it's actually all done with one composition. So let's just jump right into that. Here in my main composition, I'm just going to turn on our reference layer again. So we have our final thing, and we'll zoom in. So as you can see, it starts off pretty simple with just a basic rectangle. So I'll use my eyedropper tool to just grab these colors to start with. And I'll draw a rectangle that's roughly the right size. We will rotate this at the end. And for now, just keep everything flat. So I'll just line it up visually so it looks about right. Doesn't have to be exact, of course, because we're remaking it. So that's our base colors there. Now, additionally, we're going to need that second rectangle around the outside. So I'm just going to hit Control G with my shape layer selected. And we'll name these. We'll name this rectangle. And we'll name this one line. The second one, which we've renamed line, I'm going to Alt click on the fill until that disappears. And then on the stroke, I'll just pick my blue color again for the basic color, and we'll paste that in place there. Then with the shape selected, we'll just drag this out to make it a little bit bigger. And we'll give it a stroke width of about 4. And that looks pretty good. Let's hide our reference layer because it's a bit distracting. And we're going to need the word graphics in text. So we'll just type that out too. Graphics. And I'm going to move my anchor point with the pan behind tool. And of course, you can use the shortcut Control Alt Home to place it directly in the middle, which is what we want to do. So then I'll scale this up and center it with my other shapes. So I'll just select all 3 of these shapes, go to my align window and just choose center, center. So now they are all aligned visually to each other's center, which is great. So from here, we can pre-compose these, right click and choose pre-compose. And we'll just call this one graphics and move all the attributes. Yes, indeed. Let's double click to go inside that. And now we're working once again in our isolated workspace, which is great. So first step is to change these colors of the backgrounds, rectangle and line, to a gradient. So I'm going to Alt click on my fill, which will give me a gradient. It's already popped it in place, which is great, but I'll just show you. You can select either color stop here, choose a color from your palette, paste that color in place, just check it's the right one, and hit OK. And then you can drag these sliders to position your gradient however you'd like. I'm going to do the same thing on the line around the outside, like M&M, and we'll reposition that, but the opposite direction. And now we've got this graphics gradient color going one way and the other way, which is perfect. Just like before, we're going to right click our text and choose Create Shapes from Text, which gives us our graphics as an outline. And also, just like before, we're going to duplicate and delete this layer until we have all of our letters separate. So GRAPHICS. Then on the first layer here, we'll just select all of these and delete them. On the second layer, we will select everything except the R and delete it, and so on. And I'll just fast forward through that because we've done it before. So now we have all of our layers separated out into different sections, which is great. So we will select each of these layers here and press Control Alt Home, and that will place their anchor points in the middle, which is fantastic. So let's take a look at animating these first because it's the simplest bit. On all of these layers, we want the same thing to happen, which is the scale, so S, and the rotation, so Shift R to bring up both. And we just want them to spin and scale up. So we'll keyframe all of those, move over, say 1 second. So Control Shift right, right, right. Place another keyframe. And then back on our first keyframe, we'll put the scale down to 0. And on our second keyframe, we'll put the rotation up to 1 full-time round. So 1 plus 0 degrees. Select all these keyframes, hit F9, go to our graph editor and make them go from fast to slow. So all the same stuff we've done before. You should be getting pretty consistent at this now. Looks okay. But let's sequence those layers so that they start one after the other. I'm going to press Control right, maybe 3 frames. And then Alt close square bracket to cut off my layer. Now we've done this before, I think, in this series. So I'm just going to Shift select all of these layers, right click and choose Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers. what this does is positions each layer in the order that you clicked them, one after the other with no overlap, as long as you set no overlap. Then we can just extend our layers again back to the end of the composition. And we have our layers now spinning in one at a time. They are, however, currently fills, and I do believe in the original that they were strokes. And then after the stroke has finished rotating in, we have this some kind of Venetian blinds effect in the background. So we'll fix that now as well. Let's go back to our motion comp. Sorry, not our motion comp, our graphics comp. And I will just Alt-click with these layers selected until we remove our fill. Click once to get our stroke, make sure it's a white stroke. There we have our graphics word created. So to create this Venetian blinds effect, I'm actually going to duplicate my layers here. So G through to S, just duplicate that with Control D, and we'll press Control open square bracket to push them below. Then we can just pre-compose this just to keep it neat, and we'll call this graphics inner. Like so, that's going to give us a composition underneath. If we go inside that composition, we can Alt-click our stroke until that disappears, and once again give ourselves a fill. This time we'll just make it black. And so we can see what we're doing. We'll just click this small button here next to the active camera pop-up, which makes the background of our composition transparent. I'm going to just collapse all of this down until we get our keyframes, and we don't need our keyframes in here, so I'm just going to remove them by deleting them. And let's make sure that our layers are visible for the entire time. Now, if you haven't moved your playhead, you should be at the point where your last keyframe ended. If not, just go back to that last keyframe and go to your graphics inner again, and you'll find yourself just where that last keyframe is. We're then going to create an adjustment layer with Control, Alt, and Y, and we'll rename this Venetian blinds, and go to our effects and presets panel and find the Venetian blinds transition. If you apply it to the adjustment layer, it will affect everything underneath it, which is great. So we're just going to drag our transition completion up to 50% just for now, so we can see where what our work looks like. And I'm going to choose 45 degrees for this, to put it at 45 degrees, obviously. Quite easy, this one. We'll just drag the transition completion to 100 and keyframe it. Go over 1 second, change that back to 50. Boom, there you go. Let's give it a bit of easing in the same way that we usually do. And we have our Venetian blinds coming in. Let's press Tab to bring up the mini composition flowchart, and go back up to graphics, and there you go. All we'll do now is we'll offset this a little bit just by moving it down. And let's try playing with the blending mode. What does soft light looks like? That looks much better. And let's drop soft light's opacity down to about 40%. And now we have our letters spinning in and our Venetian blinds appearing, which is fantastic. In our main footage, you can see that when the graphics appears and the background Venetian blinds is finished coming in, you'll notice that if you watch carefully, the line around the box fills in from start to end. So we just need to add a line trim to that line around the edge. So let's do that. Let's collapse everything. Oops, I keep going back to the motions one rather than the graphics one. It's my mistake. Let's collapse everything and take our line, and we'll just add a line trim to it. Very simple. So let's scroll this layer down and choose this add icon here, and we'll choose trim path. This one's nice and simple. We have a start and an end property. We're just going to drag the end property down to 0. You'll notice that it starts over here on the right-hand side. If I press Control-Shift-H, that will hide and show our guidelines so I can just see more clearly. Where we actually want it to start is in the middle. So if you drag your offset back a bit until it goes to roughly the middle, and of course you can then press Control-Shift-H to bring it back and make sure that it's perfectly in the middle, about there. Then when our line starts, it will start from that section. So let's keyframe the end position. Let's move over 2 seconds this time, and we'll drag the end position all the way up to 100. F9. And this time we'll make it start a little bit slowly and end a little bit slowly as well. So we get this nice easing in and out motion. Fantastic. Okay, so that is the setup for our graphics section done. Okay. So if you ignore all of this extra stuff that's happening on top here, excuse me, all this extra stuff that's happening on top, the inner portion of this animation is finished. So now the next section is just adding these boxes over the top and affecting how they piece together our graphics section. So whilst this looks fairly complicated, it's actually pretty simple. It's the same technique applied several times. So let's go inside our graphics composition here. And believe it or not, we're actually going to pre-compose everything once again. So we'll select everything here. We'll choose pre-compose and we'll just call this graphics main. And now we have our main composition, inside of which has our graphics composition, inside of which has our graphics main composition, inside of which has all of our work. So we want to be on graphics main, this section here. If we go back up one, we are in the graphics composition. We are looking at graphics main. Okay. I'm going to draw a new shape on top. Let's just give it no fill and a red stroke. So I'll bring up my color palette once more, grab red. And again, my color palette's just in a web page on the other screen. And I'll draw myself a box over the center of our graphics pane. And you can center that quite easily with the Align tab. Just pop it in the middle of the composition and then drag it down until it's visually centered, which looks about right. And let's thicken up this border to about 8 pixels. It's a bit chunky. Let's make it 6. Okay, great. On that same layer, we're going to choose our rectangle tool once again. Let's draw, if we zoom in, on the same layer with the shape layer selected, a square over the edge of this corner. Then if we twirl down this rectangle too, and we choose stroke 1, we can reduce that stroke width to 0 here, which gets rid of it. And we can add a fill. You see here, fill 1 has already got a fill, but it doesn't actually compute. So if you delete that fill and on rectangle 2, just choose add fill again, that will actually fill it in correctly. Just a little quirk where we created it because it didn't have a fill before. And let's choose white. Now let's twirl this down so it's less distracting. And we'll select rectangle 2 directly, not the shape layer, but rectangle 2, and just press Ctrl D to duplicate it. And we'll position one of these at each corner. And we'll also position one in the middle of each line as well. Let's do the corners first. And this is making it look like a fake version of these controls here. Let's pop you in the middle. The reason I do it this way around is so that once I've chosen where the middle is on this rectangle, which is about there, I can duplicate that shape and just drag it down directly. So I don't have to worry about aligning these two because they're already aligned. Same thing if I go back to rectangle 5, for example, duplicate that. I can drag it down, find where I think the middle is roughly, duplicate it again, and then just, oops, I did the whole layer there, so you have to be careful. Duplicate it again, there we go, and move it across, and I know that it's at the right vertical height. Now, the reason we did it this way is that now I can adjust and scale this entire layer by itself. Those boxes look a little bit chunky, but I think I'll leave them for now. Doesn't matter too much. Great, so now we have our controller, which we're going to call controller. I'm going to take another rectangle and I'm going to select my graphics main layer and I'm going to draw a mask that aligns with the red line here. Like so. Okay. Bam. Now we have a mask over our graphics main layer and a controller on top that we're going to use to scale it. First thing I'm going to do though is duplicate my graphics main layer, delete the mask on the bottom one and just hide that so that we've got a raw copy that we're not editing. Okay, so now we have a raw copy and we have our duplicate copy as well. Let's take our duplicate graphics main and we'll just call this 1 and we'll call this 1C for controller. And I will pick whip layer 1 to layer 1C. And this means that when I move layer 1C, the rest of it moves with it. And you can probably see where we're going with this now. Let's find when we want this to appear. So if we go back to our graphics main, our main layer, not graphics main layer, we can see when we want this to start appearing. So we've got our shapes coming in. Let's have it appear about there. Let's check whether that aligns with our original footage. So when does it appear in the main composition? Yeah, just after the red comes up, we've got our shapes appearing here. So that works perfect for us. Let's go to our main layer, find when the red starts to appear in motion, which is about there. And then under our graphics layer, we know that this is the point where we'd like it to start. Okay, so I'm going to just choose scale, rotation, and position. And we're going to scale and rotate first of all. Let's make that take 1 second. Again, we're not going to rotate a full-time round. We'll just go back to our first keyframe and choose maybe -45. Yeah. And the scale can be 0. So if we keyframe those and give them a bit of easing, we can then offset our rotation by selecting these keyframes and pressing Alt, Shift, and right. So now it scales up, rotates into position, and then at the last section, we want to move it into position. So we can do that by actually offsetting it in the first place. So let's just have this one move down. Now I've done those backwards accidentally, so I'll just select those keyframes, keyframe assistant, time reverse, and that'll just flip them around. Let's press F9 on those there, give them a bit of easing. And we want it to sort of move into position last. So that's already at the right position there. It's going to scale up, move across, rotate into position. Fantastic. You'll notice that our animation here on our graphics mains layers has already completed because that animation is already appearing here, that animation is already taking place here early in the composition before our animation is actually scaling and rotating into place. That's really easy. You just drag your layers here like so. Okay, makes sense. So let's clip this layer like so. And now we know we've got it starting in the right place, or at least one of these starting in the right place. Where we have our last keyframe, let's just duplicate 1 and 1C, pop them on top, and now we'll have 2 and 1C2. I will remove this mask to give us our full layer back. I will remove all keyframes from this layer, giving us a blank layer again. And that means that I can now unlink 2 from there so that when I move, when I move our controller layer, it is no longer directly affecting the layer. I can use that to scale its position down, or scale its position down, scale its scale down, and just move it into a separate position, say here, for example. Okay. I can then relink this layer, create another mask on 2, and repeat those steps. Okay. We're going to go back to here where the layer starts. We'll keyframe these. I'll do them all at once. So we know that rotation, let's have this one be 45 degrees as opposed to -45 degrees. Let's have the scale be 0. And let's have the position just be up and left a bit. So now it's going to move into position diagonally. Hit F9 on all of those. Give ourselves some easing. And then we can just offset them. So we want scale first, obviously, then rotation, then position. Now we have 2 of these taking place. And of course, if you want to, you can offset these so that they don't appear all at once. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, this is moving much slower than the original, but that's fine because we can speed it all up at the end. this just all comes into place a lot slower. You can see these ones just whip in a bit more if we watch that. And that's just because they're not a full second long, but save that to the end and we will just Alt drag these to make them much quicker and slower. Okay. So I'm going to go through now and create enough of these shapes that we cover pretty much everything, the whole of this section, but I will leave little gaps in the middle just to show you how I did it exactly the same as the example. So to keep things simple, I will not offset them for the moment. I will leave them all at the right time. I'll time lapse through the rest and we'll come out on the other side. Okay, so there you have it. I did something a little bit different with the last one, making it go from horizontal landscape to vertical or portrait, which I think looks pretty good. So the last step, once you've done all these, is to, first of all, just sequence them slightly. So we're going to collapse all these down. And seeing as there's only 4 layers, I'll just sequence them manually, probably a bit easier. I'll just go over 1, 2, 3 frames. Let's do the same here. 1, 2, 3 frames. And do the same here, 2, 3 frames. So now we have these layers coming in sequence. That looks much nicer. I'm going to select all these layers and press U, and we'll just speed this up a little bit. So we'll grab all of these. Maybe we want it to be finished by about here, and we'll hover over the last frame, hold Alt and drag, and this will compress your keyframes whilst maintaining all the animation. And that looks much nicer. There we go. So the last step is once all these pieces are in place, you're going to want to remember that original layer that we had before that we hid. Okay. You could just want to turn that layer back on, choose opacity and take, say, 15 frames to go from opacity 0 to opacity 100. So that just fades that in the background. And at the same time, just take all of these layers here, grab their opacity and put it down to 0. And then you have the boxes fading. Now you could, if you wanted to, offset this a little bit so that the pieces finish fading in and then the boxes fade away. And again, if you wanted to, you could offset your fading out keyframes as well. So 1, 2, 3, like so. Let's do 1, 2, 3 again. And the final one's 1, 2, 3 here. So now we have our keyframes fading out in sequence, which looks a little bit nicer. Let's save, go back up to our main composition and see what that looks like. Looking here, fantastic. Boom, 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 boom. And we all have our pieces coming together like so. That looks pretty good if I do say so myself. Okay, I think I'm fairly happy with that. Let's just check it against the original. See if there's anything that we missed. Yes, we missed the wiggling of the letters inside our graphics symbol there. Very easy to do. So let's do that as our final step. Let's go inside our graphics main layer. So we have all of our wiggling letters here. And we'll press P to bring up the position keyframe in all of these. Okay. Now, we could apply a wiggle expression to each one of these layers, but it means that whenever we want to change it, or if we want to change it, we'd have to come back through and change all of those individual layers. So instead, what I think I'm going to do is create an adjustment layer with a wiggle and using sliders, and then we'll apply that to all of these layers underneath it. So inside our graphics main composition, we'll press Ctrl-Alt-Y to create a new adjustment layer, and we'll just name that wiggle. And on our adjustment layer, we are going to put something called a slider. In fact, we're going to put 2 slider controls. So we'll have first slider control and we'll have second slider control. I'll name the first one frequency and I'll name the second one intensity, although it doesn't really matter what you name these. Okay. Right. So we're going to go to our first letter here, G, and Alt click the position keyframe. Then we have to set some variables. Okay. So we're going to say, I want the amount of times per second that it wiggles to be my frequency slider value. And I want the amount that it wiggles, the amount of pixels, to be my intensity slider value. Okay, so inside here, we're just going to say frequency. So new variable, frequency equals, and then we will pick whip to this slider. Then we'll press semicolon to close the line of text. Then we'll say new variable, intensity equals. Looks like we can't call it intensity, so let's call it inten. Is that enough? Yes. So because that was blue there, I think that means that it's int is already like a reserved name, so we shouldn't call it int. We'll call it inten instead. Then we will drag to that slider and press semicolon. Then we will choose wiggle, open brackets, frequency, comma, intensity, close parentheses. And that gets rid of our warning. Okay. So what we have now is the wiggle. This layer is going to wiggle based on frequency and intensity, which at the moment are 0, which means we should have no wiggle. Very good. If we crank these suckers up, we're going to have a crazy wiggle. Whoa, look at that wiggle. Okay, so that's probably a bit much. So what I want is it to gradually decrease in wiggle over time. So at the start, let's keyframe. Let's move over, say, to 2 seconds so that all of our letters are in place. And let's keyframe again. And here, let's say 6 times a second, I want it to wiggle 3 pixels. And that's what our wiggle is going to end up like. At the start, however, I want it to just be massive. Let's say like 6 times or 12 times a second, let's wiggle 30 pixels. And then it will go crazy and decrease. Because we have our values decreasing over time, it's going crazy. Look at all that crazy wiggle. And then it's reducing down to basically no wiggle here. Okay, let's just ease that out a little bit. Super amount of wiggle down to no wiggle. Perfect. Now what we need to do is just copy and paste this into our other position keyframes. So that should work now on the R, which it does indeed. So it comes into settle and then they start wiggling, which is great. So we'll just copy and paste that into all the others. Now, yes, there is some copy and pasting, which obviously takes a little time. But what this means is if I change any of those keyframes on the wiggle adjustment layer, it will change them for all of them here. So all of our letters are wiggling. If I were to, for example, make this go quicker, it would happen much quicker, like so. And I think that's a little bit too intense. So we will just reduce it down to, say, 5 times a second, 2 pixels. Oops, I did that on both accidentally there because I had all those selected. So we will just make sure that we didn't balls that up. And we'll go just to this keyframe and we'll choose 5 times a second, 2 pixels. And our final things are a bit less crazy. There we go. Perfect. Now let's look at that in our main composition and see what we've made. Perfecto. That looks pretty dang good to me. Hello everybody and welcome to the final episode of Intro to Motion Graphics 2021 and back to TipTut. Let's jump right in then. So if you've made it this far, well done. You're one of the very few that actually finishes things. And let's see what we've made so far. We have our intro to motion and the dropping down and the sliding in of the graphics. It looks pretty dang cool. I'm pretty happy with it. Now is the final step. If we look at our reference footage once again, the final step that we have here is this After Effects logo coming in and bloating like so, and then some 3D letters popping in and kind of rotating and smushing into place. So we're doing that today, and we'll also be adding all of the texture into our animations. We get all this nice crunchy, wobbly lines on it as well. So without any further ado, let's just jump right into that. Let's go back to our main composition, turn on our reference layer for the final time, and we will drag it over the top so we can see what we're doing. And let's add in some of these contents here. So I have just an After Effects logo. I think I put it in the resources file. If not, it's just from Wikipedia. So I'm sure you'll be able to find it. And we'll just drop that into our composition. Let's pop that on top and scale it down a little bit because it's too big. Let's just place that over our reference footage. And again, we haven't made a one-to-one creation here, so I'm not worried too much about it being exact. Then we just need a piece of text that says 2021. Really nice and simple this time around. Control-Alt-Home, of course, to bring our anchor point to the middle. And let's scale it up a little bit. And you can see here that these letters are slightly more spaced out. So I'm just going to select my text and we're just going to increase this kerning here until it's a little bit closer to what we want. Looks like I'm on a slightly wrong font. So let's make it extra bold. Yeah, extra bold is the font that we want. Of course, you might be using your own fonts. So just tweak that until it's roughly in the right position, which it is. And I believe that this is the blue color from my color palette, but it's just on a different blending mode. So I will select that blue and pop it in like so. Let's drag our reference layer to the bottom and hide it. And once more for the final time, pre-compose. And we'll just call this bit 2021. Let's go inside 2021 here at frame 1, because we'll just then reposition it to the timing that we want. And let's do this logo first, because this is nice and easy. So I'm going to keyframe my scale. We're going to go about a second and give ourselves a couple of keyframes. And on the first keyframe, we'll just make that scale 0. It's going to scale up like so. Let's hit F9 on those to give us a bit of easy easing. Whack our graph in the same way that we've done before by just dragging. Boom. Nice and simple. Scaling up there. And I'm just going to turn on the transparency background by toggling next to active camera. But it looks a little bit unnatural and boring. So with the layer selected, we're just going to go up to effects and presets, and we're going to use warp to create some pucker and bloat, which is my favorite word, pucker and bloat. So we just want the one that is under distort warp. There's quite a few, so just make sure you're on the right one. And we'll just drag that down onto our icon layer here. Now it's automatically going to make it freak out a little bit, but don't worry. We do not want the warp style to be arc. We want the warp style to be bulge. And as you can see here, we can create a nice little bulging effect. And we want the warp axis to be vertical. Let's see if we can't do something like inflate to make it look a little bit nicer. Yeah, inflate looks much nicer. Let's choose inflate. So that bends on both axes, which is great. So let's go back to our first keyframe, and halfway between that and our second keyframe, so on frame 15, let's add in another keyframe for scale and just make it slightly larger. So now we've got it coming up, scaling up, and settling back down into place. On our speed graph for this, we want it to go from fast to slow. So we'll just drag that second handle. And the second one, we want it to go from slow to fast, so that we get this nice boing, settling into position kind of animation. Then we want our bend amount to be, let's say, -15. By the time it gets to here, let's have it be +15. Oh, let's push it a bit further. That looks hilarious. Then by the time it gets to the third frame, the third keyframe here, oops, let's put the keyframes on that. So 30 there and -15 on the start. By the time it gets back to here, we actually want it to be at, say, -5 or so. Let's put it at -10, make it a bit better. And then let's extend past it one more step and then go back to 0. And that's just going to add a nice bit of overlapping animation for us. Let's put it at exactly 15 frames after. Again, let's F9 all those keyframes. And we want this one to be the same kind of thing. So we want it to hold its pucker and hold its bloat. But then this one we want to be slightly less influenced. So now it comes in. And now we get that nice little settling squishiness to it. Perfect. Okay, great. Let's have After Effects pop in. And by the time it's finished and it's just settling in, we'll have our 2021 animation begin. So same thing we've done before. Let's right click these, choose Create, shapes from text. Let's hide our original layer, and we'll duplicate this 4 times. And then the same thing we've always done, which is to twirl down the contents and delete all those bits that we don't need on each layer. Won't fast forward through this bit because there's only 4. And we'll rename them so that we don't get lost. It's very important to label your layers. And then again, Control, Alt, and Home. And that places all of your anchor points in the middle. For this one though, we actually want them to be at the bottom. So we'll grab our anchor point pan behind tool and we'll just drag them down. You have to do it 1 layer at a time, like so, and just position it. I've actually got a plugin called Motion V2, which allows me to do it with 1 click, which is very useful, but you can just use the pan behind tool like we've done all the other times. It won't take you long. These layers, we're going to do a little bit of 3D, which I thought might be fun. So we're going to toggle our switches down here with this button until we see this 3D column here. And we're just going to drag until there's a little box in all of our 3D columns. And that allows us to rotate these items in 3D space. Select all of them and press R, and you'll notice now that you have a much more complex rotation panel, and you can rotate all of these in 3D space. So we're going to rotate them all 90 degrees and see what that looks like. Might have to be slightly less than 90. Let's make it slightly more than 90. And let's keyframe all of those orientations there. Let's go forward 30 frames, although we'll probably end up squishing it. And let's drag it so that they rock backwards. They overshoot a little bit. Let's go 15 frames and put them back at normal. And we should now have these letters overshooting and settling into place. Let's add some easy ease to all of these. Let's have them rocket into position. So just select our middle keyframe and our last keyframe and just have them like the M shape from before. And let's take it a step further, actually. Let's say another 15 frames. We'll just say another 10 frames. Let's have it overshoots by, say, like 5 degrees. Another 10 frames, back to 0. Okay. And now, if we check these, and we just press F9 to smooth those out, we should have a slightly more complex settling animation. Let's have a look. Perfect. There we go. Brilliant. Let's collapse these layers down. Let's Alt open square bracket on the first keyframe so that they start in the right position. And let's duplicate them. Control and Shift and right square bracket to push them above it. And then Control and right, say 6 frames, and then open square bracket to push them over 6 frames. Then on this first layer, let's get rid of the fill. Rubbish fill, we don't want it. And let's give it a yellow stroke of 4 pixels, let's say. But I want these to disappear as they flick up, as like just a little precursor to that first bit. So these are going to flick into position. Doosh, 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 doosh. And by the time, 4 is way too chunky. Let's have it still be at 2. Yeah. By the time these blue ones catch up, so let's say about there, as soon as the yellows begin to overtake, let's cut those layers. Okay. Select all of our layers with Shift, and I definitely want to speed this all up a bit. So let's compress that down. Let's see what that looks like. Very nice. Although let's have the yellows cut here instead. Perfect. Now we just need to offset these layers. So I'm going to select all of these layers. We're going to go to position them all at the same start point, essentially. And just line up these keyframes from where we compress them. Let's say 3 frames, and Alt close square bracket to cut those off. And let's do the same sequencing layers that we did before. And then drag these guys back out. We don't want these to appear any longer than their first keyframes, but we do want all of these to just continue on for the entire length of the duration of the composition. And now we have our shapes popping into position and popping out as well. So let's have a look at that. That looks quite nice. They appear a bit too early because they should appear on their keyframes. So we'll just fix that. So then they're already in motion by the time they pop up. Fantastic. Okay. I believe these were on hard light blending mode. So let's do that first of all, which obviously won't change until we put it in our main composition. So let's put it in our main composition. When do we want this to appear? Probably, I'd say about there. So let's just open square bracket, on the correct layer, 2021, to push that there and look at our pretty much finished animation. Looking nice, hopping in, intro to motion, graphics, 2021. Fantastic. Okay. So the only last thing to do then is all the lovely stuff on top that makes this look crunchy and real. So we'll do that with a simple adjustment layer. Control Alt and Y to create a new adjustment layer. And I like to just call this one noise. Let's then add an effect and preset of noise. And the amount of noise, you want noise and grain, and then noise underneath that. The amount of noise depends on the overall size of your composition. I find for a composition of this size, about 10% looks quite nice for me. Just add some of that realness back in. Essentially, everything looks a bit too digital. You want to make it look a little bit more analog. So just a touch of noise there. Then to create the rough and bumpy edges that you saw in the original, let's just have a look at that. You can see all these delicious crunchy edges like so. We're going to use a turbulent displace effect, not its intended use, essentially. Let's just type in turb to bring up turbulent and displace, and it is under distort, not noise and grain. It's turbulent displace. Let's grab that and drag it onto our layer, and everything's going to look suddenly very wobbly. So let's zoom right in. We basically want the size to be tiny, so we're just going to crank that size all the way down. Oh, and there's some of that lovely wobble already. I find an amount of about 30 or perhaps 40 for this size works well. But the most important one is complexity, which you drag all the way to the top to create all those lovely little bumps. Now, this will make your computer render a bit slowly. So what I find the best thing to do is whilst you're working on this is to turn this off and then just turn it on when you're ready to render, essentially. I think the final thing we did was take our 2021 and turn it to hard light on this above layer. Oh, hard light, maybe not. Maybe it was vivid light. Oh, maybe it was soft light. Maybe it was multiply. Multiply, there we go. Multiply looks much nicer. Sorry, it's been a while since I actually made this in real life. So there we have our finished thing. The final step is to add our crumpled paper and our texture to our background. So on our background layer from before, we are just going to add a simple linear ramp. A simple gradient ramp, not a linear ramp, my fault. Gradient ramp there from underneath generate. And it's just going to be very simple, going from white to slightly gray, just to add a bit of texture to that background. Lovely job. Now, on top of the noise layer, we're going to bring in our assets, which you can find in the description. And these assets are our 3 pieces of crumpled plastic texture. So we're just going to drag those in to our project window. And we're going to create a looping texture with these. To do that, I'm just going to grab my first one, pop it onto my layer here, and choose a blending mode that I like. Probably soft light. Let's have a look. That makes it look a little bit dark. Let's try overlay. Again, makes it look a little bit dark. What about screen? Screen makes it look a little bit too bright. Let's choose lighten for now. Lighten loses a lot of that detail. You can still see some of it, but not enough for my mind. So let's choose soft light, which brings in a lot of the detail, but reduce its opacity to about 70%. There, that looks much nicer. Okay. So using that, I'm just going to pre-compose this layer. Right click, pre-compose. And we'll just call this texture. And we'll move all the attributes into the new composition. That's fine. Let's open up our texture comp, and you can see that we have this file here now. We actually want this to be a rather short composition, so I'm going to zoom all the way in. I'm going to press Control right, maybe 3 frames, and then Control-Shift-D to split my layer. And that just gives me 3 frames of this image. Let's duplicate that twice. So we've got 3 copies. And then using the other 2 textures with the layer selected in the Layers palette and the file selected in the Project panel, just hold Alt and drag them over each other and they will replace that image. So we'll do that with these 2. We can then offset these just by dragging them. And you can feel free to play around with the size and scale and positioning until you get a texture that you're fond of. For example, on this last one, I think there's too much information. So I'm just going to reposition it like that. And this one, there's too much information at the top. So we'll just reposition it there. And this one, I don't like that crumpled bit. So we'll just do that as well. So now we've got 3 pictures like so. Let's check what our frame rate for this is, 30 frames per second. So let's have these last, say, perhaps 5 frames. So every half a second, we'll have a loop. That looks pretty nice. If that feels too fast, you can obviously just slow it down. Let's try it at a full second because you don't want it to be too distracting of a texture. That looks a bit nicer to me. So I'm now just going to trim this composition to be 1 second in length by going to 1 frame before 1 second and pressing N, and then right-click Trim Comp to Work Area. And that's going to give us a 1 second looping composition. Okay, let's go back now to our main. And as you can see here, it's changed our texture to normal, so we'll just have to change that back to soft light. And we can see it in action, and you can kind of see, it might not turn up on the video on YouTube. So maybe I'll just, for YouTube, let's do it on a different one. Let's do it on overlay. Let's turn off our noise for now, just play about until you find the right thing. You might choose multiply, actually, and then invert your texture layer. That looks quite nice. And then we could reduce the opacity of that down to say like 40. That looks pretty good, actually. Let's keep that for now, but obviously you can play around and choose whatever blending modes that you like. Let's now right-click this layer, choose Time, enable time remapping, or the shortcut for that is Control-Alt-T. Let's Alt-click Time Remap and just type in loop out. Open and close parentheses, semicolon. This will make your animation loop, but be careful because at the end of it, you might get a single frame of blankness there, okay? This may happen every time, or it may only happen on the first time. So all I'm going to do is, because it's happening on that first time, is just clip that layer and move it over. And now when we play, we have a looping texture. It does seem to have that flashing frame. So instead, what you can do is keyframe 1 frame before it and then delete it. And that should fix it for you. If it doesn't, then you can choose to continually rasterize your layer by checking this box here. And that will definitely stop the flicker. There's just a few little, I don't know if they're bugs or just I'm misusing the intended feature, but I talk about it in my looping compositions tutorial anyway. That should allow you then to just have your continuously looping file without it flickering. I think that flicker is because it's the last frame in the composition and there is actually technically no information there. Whereas if you choose continually rasterize, it will continue that information essentially. So let's just wait for this final little part to render and we can watch our finished animation in all its glory. And go. There you have it. You are now officially a beginner at motion graphics. Well done for finishing this course. I hope you enjoyed this lesson series. It's a bit of an update from an older series that I did. I tried to incorporate some more modern techniques and some more interesting mograph for you guys. Apologies if it was a bit all over the place. I was trying to incorporate most of the basic stuff that you're going to need to know to get working in After Effects. And I try to ramp up the speed per episode as well so that you don't get bored repeating the same things. If you have any feedback, please let me know. These longer series are kind of hard to judge. So please do tell me in the comments anything you think I could improve for next time. And hopefully I'll be able to do a more advanced series on motion graphics in the near future. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you next time for another episode of TipTut. Congratulations once again. Massive thank yous once again to my level 2 and above members, without whom TipTut would not be possible. You guys are super delightful. If you'd like to become a member of the TipTut Zone, you can click that join button below for exclusive perks and benefits.
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.